China is a nation whose destiny has always been shaped by the blessings and curses of its geography, a landmass that has both allowed it to grow into one of the largest civilizations in human history and simultaneously exposed it to vulnerabilities that still define its political and strategic choices today, because while its territory has nurtured the rise of nearly 1.4 billion people, it has never enjoyed the natural protection of oceans, impassable mountains, or isolated plains in the way that other powerful nations like the United States or even Russia have, meaning that from the very beginning geography has been both a gift and a burden. The roots of what we call Chinese history almost always begin with the Yellow River civilization, and the reason why this settlement evolved into the most populous region on Earth lies in the fertile floodplains of the Yellow River, which remain some of the most productive agricultural lands in the world, ensuring food surpluses, cultural expansion, and population growth. Indeed, the entirety of eastern China is remarkably well-suited for agriculture. The soil is rich, the rainfall dependable, the climate temperate enough for continuous growth, and this combination has always been the cornerstone of China's success. Moreover, the conditions are not just favorable for single harvests, but for what is known as double cropping. Farmers can plant and harvest rice in June and July, and then quickly sow a secondary crop to be harvested in October, effectively boosting rice output by around 25% without expanding land usage. Rice is, of course, one of the most calorie-dense crops, producing roughly 11 million calories per acre compared to wheat, which dominates Europe and yields only about 4 million calories per acre, and this single fact explains why China has historically been able to sustain such a massive population. Its land simply allows it to feed more people on less acreage. Yet this abundance does not erase the other side of China's geographic reality. Its borders are not blessed with strong natural defenses. To the south, China meets Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar, three nations whose borders with China were not shaped by rivers or mountains but arbitrarily drawn after conflicts. The Sino-French War for Vietnam, the aftermath of the Vietnam War for Laos, and a short war in the 1960s with Myanmar, meaning that China has no inherent geographical buffers here. While China is larger and militarily more advanced, these three countries combined maintain nearly 1 million active troops compared to China's just over 2 million, and in the case of conflict, their advantage would be the jungle terrain, one of the most grueling environments for modern armies to navigate, as demonstrated in the long, drawn-out Vietnam War where the jungle itself seemed to resist invasion. In fact, this lack of natural defense means that it would technically be easier for Vietnam, Laos, or Myanmar to conduct incursions into Chinese territory than for China to push deeply into theirs, since jungle warfare slows down supply lines, complicates logistics, and favors defenders who know the terrain intimately. This geographic vulnerability to the south is balanced somewhat by China's situation to the west, where the relationship with India, a neighbor of comparable size and ambition, has been perpetually tense. Border disputes, clashes along the line of actual control, and political mistrust make the relationship between China and India fragile at best, hostile at worst, and it is within this context that Tibet becomes crucial. Tibet, historically its own empire, was absorbed into China only in the past 3 centuries, and ethnically and culturally Tibetans are vastly different from the Han majority of eastern China, making Tibet's place within the Chinese state tenuous and often resisted by the native population. Yet the strategic logic of holding Tibet is undeniable. Despite housing only 0.2% of China's vast population, Tibet makes up nearly 13% of its territory, and its sheer emptiness functions as a buffer. If Tibet were independent, it would almost certainly fall into the cultural and economic orbit of either India or China, but Beijing sees Indian influence there as an existential threat because Tibet is the shield that extends China's border to the Himalayas, one of the most formidable mountain ranges in the world. Those mountains slow down the movement of troops and limit the possibility of a large-scale invasion, buying China time in any conflict. Without Tibet, Indian forces would be on the doorstep of eastern China's dense and vulnerable population centers, which is something Beijing cannot risk. Tibet's utility, however, is not only military, it is also hydrological. The water that sustains China's agricultural heartland, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, flows from the Tibetan Plateau. If a foreign power controlled Tibet and by extension its water supply, China's food security would be catastrophically threatened, making control of Tibet not merely strategic but existential. This is why China has invested heavily in integrating Tibet, not only through political control but through infrastructure. The world's highest railroad now connects Tibet to the Chinese core, highways crisscross once remote terrain, and new airports bring the region closer to the rest of China. At the same time, Beijing has encouraged migration of Han Chinese into Tibet, subtly altering demographics, because the government recognizes that military control alone is insufficient if the local population views invaders as liberators rather than enemies. Beyond Tibet, to the north lies another critical geographical asset, Mongolia. With its vast empty steppes, sparse population, and position as a buffer between China and Russia, Mongolia represents a zone of low concern. An invading army would face the desolation of the Gobi Desert and near-impossible supply lines, making invasion from this direction impractical. Moreover, Mongolia's only other neighbor is Russia, which remains, at least for now, a close ally of China economically and militarily. Unless relations with Russia collapse, China's northern border is secure. But the eastern border tells a different story. At first glance, the Pacific Ocean should be China's greatest defense. Yet in reality, the ocean is a vulnerability because just across it lies the United States and its powerful Pacific presence. The US maintains bases in South Korea, Japan, and Guam, and holds alliances with Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, and increasingly with the Philippines, meaning that if conflict erupted, Washington could impose a naval blockade cutting China off from maritime access. For a country whose economy is overwhelmingly export-driven and whose population requires constant imports of food and energy, such a blockade would be disastrous. This recognition explains China's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea, where it has built artificial islands and military bases to secure sovereignty and ensure passage to the Pacific. Yet these very actions have worsened its relations with neighbors like the Philippines, a country whose ambiguous alliance with the US could have been shifted toward China if not for the disputes over sovereignty in those waters. Without secure sea lanes, China faces the terrifying prospect of economic collapse, domestic unrest, and potential regime change if food and jobs vanish. This maritime vulnerability marks a sharp departure from China's historical posture. For centuries, China did not seek to project power globally, confining itself to regional dominance within Asia, rarely colonizing abroad, and maintaining only limited naval capacity. But as its economy ballooned, the old model became insufficient. China now imports more food and oil than it produces, a reversal that underscores its dependence on global trade. Africa has emerged as a critical partner in this arrangement. Chinese corporations, often backed by the state, have poured investment into African infrastructure, agriculture, and resource extraction, buying land, drilling oil, and mining minerals. Some call this neocolonialism, but from Beijing's perspective, it is survival. Africa supplies the nation that supplies the world. However, this also deepens China's vulnerability because it means the country is reliant on foreign powers and overseas supply chains at a time when tensions with those same powers are intensifying. Thus, China's geography, while often lauded for its fertile lands and central location, is paradoxically also its greatest weakness. To the south and east, it faces potential adversaries and maritime threats. To the north and west, it has vast but sparsely populated buffer zones that cannot support offensive campaigns, and across the ocean lies the United States with unmatched naval power. While China's nuclear arsenal ensures that full-scale war with superpowers is unlikely, the strategic disadvantages of its geography remain stark, and they inform every major decision the government makes. From infrastructure investment in Tibet to artificial islands in the South China Sea, from demographic engineering in remote regions to partnerships in Africa. Geography has allowed China to rise, but it has also placed the regime in a precarious position where survival depends not just on economic strength or military might, but on constant vigilance against the vulnerabilities written into its very landscape.